Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jerry McDermott. I'm the Media and Communications Manager here at Fingal County Council, and I'll be your host for tonight's webinar, which is part of the process that will ultimately lead to the adoption of Fingol's new Biodiversity Action Plan, which will cover the period from 2022 to 2030. The Biodiversity Action Plan puts forward an ambitious programme of 100 actions to reverse the decline in biodiversity by 2030, and the actions are based upon recommendations made in ecological studies and on proposals put forward by nature conservation NGOs, members of the public participation network, strategic policy committee members and various council departments. The purpose of tonight's webinar is to allow our biodiversity officer, Hans Visser, to explain the plan to you and then answer any questions that you might have on it. If you have a question for Hans at any stage during tonight's webinar, can you please type it into the Q&A box and send it to us? You'll find the Q&A box in the top right-hand corner of your screen. We'll do our best to answer it before the webinar ends at 8:30. If you want to make a submission to the Draft Biodiversity Action Plan, you can do so up until July the 5th at 23:59 or 11:59 p.m. on Fingal County Council's consultation portal, which is www.consult.fingal.ie. A copy of the action plan can be downloaded from the portal, and it's also available to view at County Hall in Swords and also at the civic offices in Blanchardstown. I have my fingers crossed that we'll not experience any technical issues over the next 90 minutes, but if we do, please bear with us as we endeavour to resolve them. Now, let's get things underway, and I'm going to hand over to Hans Visser for his presentation.
This is, I suppose, an information session and a consultation session for everybody, just to kind of give you an idea what is in the draft Fingal Biodiversity Action Plan 2022-2030. I suppose we have been in a consultation process for the last sort of 2.5 years, like asking people, I suppose, what they think are the key issues and like in terms of biodiversity, and in terms also, like, I suppose, the key solutions to those problems as well. We kind of dealt with our own, I think, our county council stuff, but it's an operation, environment, parks and planning. We did a workshop sessions with the youth council, with the PPN, the environment and biodiversity SPCs, which is with their councillors. And then also various nature conservation NGOs, again, to ask them, well, what do you think are the key actions and what do we need to do about it? So very much like a lot of the actions are based around their feedback. We also review the existing EU and national biodiversity plans to allow the local plan to translate some of these international and national actions into action on the ground. And similarly, we kind of looked at the climate change action plans to see which of those are relevant and which should be incorporated into the biodiversity plan. Now, in terms of the key issues that were brought forward, these were, I suppose, the 5 that came up over and over again. So the continuous loss of biodiversity is to be addressed urgently. The Fingal County Council to go pesticide free. The open space in Fingal is to be made more pollinator and biodiversity friendly. People wanted to see more outreach and education campaigns, just supposed to make people more aware of the trouble that biodiversity is in. And also to create a climate change proof landscape, which is quite a challenge. But that was another thing that I suppose that came up over and over again. People are aware what climate change is likely to do to I suppose across the world. But I suppose if you be specific more Fingal, we're certainly not immune to any of the impacts of that as well. What we did then as well, when we kind of looked at sort of the other plans in terms of the EU biodiversity strategy, that sets out to halt biodiversity loss by 2030. There's 13 actions in that are relevant for the Fingal Biodiversity Plan. Then there's also the National Biodiversity Plan. There's 18 actions in that relate to local authorities to be implemented. Then there's also, in terms of climate change side, like there's the Biodiversity Sectoral Climate Change Adaptation Plan. It's a bit of a mouthful, but there's one action in that kind of that is to do with open space management for biodiversity. And then also there's the Fingal Climate Action Plan, and like with that, so there's 22 actions that relate to nature-based solutions, and some of these actions are now, I suppose, also incorporated in the Fingal Biodiversity Fingal Biodiversity Action Plan. Now, if you kind of look at the plan itself, there's 2 key themes that kind of run through this plan. One is the ecosystem restoration, and it's kind of tied into the theme for the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. The whole idea behind this is that we try to restore full ecosystems so they can actually function in their own right, with less human intervention. That level of human intervention required at the moment is far too expensive, and it also leads to very degraded type of ecosystems. While if nature can do it itself, it's much healthier. Similarly, bringing nature in our lives, that's the key theme of the EU biodiversity strategy, and we have incorporated as well, kind of looking to see how can we bring nature into people's daily lives. So whether it's in their gardens, whether it's in their open spaces, whether it's at the place they work, but also say from farming perspective or the regional parks perspective or the quarries, that could be anything. The whole idea is to see, I suppose, where can we kind of bring nature back into people's lives. Now, in terms of vision for the future, so we kind of took the goal of 2030 and to kind of halt the loss around that time, which is only 8 years away. So it's certainly a big challenge. We kind of had to look at, well, what is it that we need to do in order to achieve that? So we developed some sort of a visualization of that vision, basically, in order to achieve that. And I suppose if we kind of break it down, basically what it comes down to is it's sort of like the seas right around the estuaries, like the Malahide and Rogerstown and Baldoyle, that you have here. Like there's Halt is here, and then you have Dublin 15 is there, and then North County, I suppose, would take up most of that. But if you kind of look in a little bit more detail, if you kind of look in the North County, where we kind of want to see that protect the Malahide estuary, protect the Rogerstown estuary, looking at rewilding projects around the estuary. It's kind of looking at the restoration of the bog of the Ring, the restoration of Garristown Bog. We're looking at farming practices to kind of make them more biodiversity friendly, to restore a lot of the species that are associated with it. We're looking at river restoration projects to kind of restore the natural meandering state of a river with all the species that go with that. We're also looking at the expansion of woodland around Ardgillan and Main to kind of link Hampton and Milverton and Ardgillan to kind of form one larger overall woodland. Going into Dublin 15, we're kind of looking at the protection of the Talca Valley. That's actually still in a quite healthy state, and we just want to make sure that stays that way, while also providing for recreation so people can enjoy this natural environment as well. We're kind of looking at the Royal Canal, similar idea, where we provide for like a greenway through that, while at the same time trying not to damage the ecology of the place. And I suppose like in the Liffey Valley itself, we're looking at the expansion of woodland to kind of link the woodlands in St. Catherine's Park, like with the woodlands at Luttrellstown. These are some of our oldest woodlands, and by connecting them, it gives typical woodland species basically a chance to move from one place to the other. And similarly along the Liffey, we're kind of like looking at the floodplain management there to try to create a mosaic of different landscape types there to kind of to enhance that as well. So it's like a bit of a green Z between the Liffey, the canal, and the Talca, and then we would be linking this network basically all the way back to the Ward River Valley via the Pinkian River. Looking at the Dublin 50 or the whole Malahide area, we're kind of particular sort of like Malahide, I already mentioned, but sort of like Robswell's Park. We're looking at the development of the racecourse park, the management of the Baldoyle estuary, and on Halt we already have like what's called a special area amenity order operational plan that kind of sets out all the things we need to do to kind of develop Halt as a like for recreational purpose, but also all the actions we need to take to protect biodiversity in this area. So I suppose we kind of know what we need to do. And it's now, I suppose, trying to translate into action on the ground. The other element as well is, although the Fingal County Council at the moment doesn't have any direct responsibility for the marine ecosystem, like with the Marine Spatial Bill, that's going to change, and we certainly want to try to restore our marine ecosystem as well. At the moment, it's not in a great state. The Marine Institute reports clearly show massive declines in terms of shellfish and the likes of that. So what we would like to do is to actually restore a lot of the ecosystem that were there. We know from reports from the 1700s that there was extensive oyster beds in various places, in Malahide, Island's Eye, Lambay. We want to see if we can get them back. Similar with seagrass bed and kelp forest, is to try to restore this whole ecosystem basically. Now, we need around 100 actions. I suppose we identified 100 actions to halt the loss of biodiversity. We do know that's costing around 40 million euros and 6 staff to do that, and those resources are not available at the moment. So we have 30 actions. We have prioritized those based on the basis that like those are actions that are on the way, and we just want to make sure we actually complete those. Like some of those are like they're I suppose there are high enough profile projects anyway, but the whole idea is to kind of focus on those to make sure at least we kind of to deliver at least some of this. And out of that, so like out of all those actions, I suppose there's sort of eight topics in that. The developing the ecological network, there's 12 actions in that. Building for biodiversity, there's 2 actions in that. Managing open space for biodiversity. Woodland and wetland projects, there's 3 of them. There won't be any rewilding projects, but there will be agri-environment and rare breeds, there's 2 of those. And in terms of research and monitoring, there will be 5 projects of that. And then there's 3 racing awareness projects. And I suppose just to give you a flavor of the sort of thing we're kind of looking at, the Ecological Network in this case, this is in or was already established in the previous biodiversity plan, where you can see the blue areas here. They are the sort of the Rochester Estuary, the Malahide Estuary, Baldoyle, they have Halt, Lembay, Ireland's Eye, the Skerries Islands. These are all the EU designated sites. So these are our special areas of conservation. These are our special protection areas. This is, I suppose, where like these are the most important wildlife sites that we have. And like they're mainly designated for birds. So like the estuaries, like they're frequented by thousands and thousands of migratory birds during the winter months, while the islands of our coast are home to around 100,000 breeding seabirds that spend the summer here and then leave again. So we have to protect those. Like in terms of the estuaries, we also have buffer zones around the estuaries. We based on bird survey work, we know that the birds, not just I suppose during high tide, a lot of birds tend to leave the estuaries and they end up in the surrounding lands. So if we want to protect the bird populations in the estuary, not only have to protect the estuary itself, but also to the places where they go outside the estuary. And these are basically areas that are not actually protected under the EU legislation. We also then have in green, these are nature development areas. These are areas basically where we think we can combine existing functions with nature conservation. So there's large areas of farmland in there, but there's quarries in there, there is golf courses in there, there's regional parks in there, there's all the main landscapes in there. The whole idea is more that we like by tweaking the management of that and kind of working with all the landowners is just to try to kind of incorporate nature there as much as possible. And then we also have these corridors linking all these areas, and these are mainly our river corridors. The rivers in their own right are important for several EU protected species such as otter and salmon and kingfisher and bats. But by providing these corridors, it also means that you basically create a landscape through which wildlife can move. Fingal is the fastest growing county in Ireland, so like the pressure on land here is huge in terms of development. But if we protect this network, it basically means that species can still move from one place to the other. So for argument's sake, if in Newbridge, say the population of blackcaps goes extinct due to a disease, then it basically means that blackcaps from elsewhere and other woodlands can make their way down these corridors and actually repopulate those areas. So that's sort of the general principle behind it. This network is also actually already protected in our county development plan. So there's strict rules around what you can and can't do within these areas. You can sort of see the hatching and everything that's on that. This has been in place since 2010. I suppose there have been no changes made to that. In terms of the biodiversity flagship projects, like there's 2 of those at the moment that are proposed. It's the Rochester Estuary and Halt Head. In terms of the Rochestown one, we're looking at the development of a nature education centre there. There's no nature education centres in Dublin at the moment, so we would like to develop one there. We're also looking at greenway development around the estuary, so people can actually enjoy this estuary as an amenity resource, but I suppose away from the sensitive ecological areas. We're looking at wetland development to intercept a lot of the surface water drainage from the surrounding area and actually filter the water the way to clean and improve the water quality of the estuary. And we're also looking at creating areas for migratory birds, in this case the brown geese, where they can feed and rest in peace, basically. And then Halt, so that I was saying earlier on, that's more to do with the implementation of the Halt SAO operational plan. And that kind of like involves the wetland restoration projects. It is a lot of invasive species control, rhododendron in this case, but also wildfire management and heathland management are big ones as well. So like it's a lot of gorse removal to try to convert it into grassland and heathland. And we've also started the goat grazing scheme there with the Old Irish Goat Society. And the whole idea there is that these goats will basically help to graze the fire breaks, and that will kind of give the Dublin Fire Brigade a chance to actually halt the wildfires at these fire break locations. Now, I suppose kind of looking at kind of like through the given that development is still sort of like an important feature of the council, we're also looking at development guidance notes in particular, I suppose, to do with nesting facilities in buildings. Given that we're going to have so much development there, like most of the time when that place takes in farmland, most of the farmland is relatively poor in species. The main value is in hedgerows. But I suppose like housing estates in their own right can also provide space for wildlife, but it does need to be designed for. So in this case, like a lot of people are familiar with swift boxes, but there's loads more species that can avail of this. Like to give you an idea, from the house sparrows or bed boxes, swallows, and even insect plate space that you can fix to houses. They all provide opportunities for wildlife. So that's the idea, is basically we'll develop a guidance note that we can give to developers and our own architects as well to incorporate these sort of features in the houses that are going to be built in the future. Similarly, we're looking at Action 32, then it's hedgerow management. At the moment, what's happening, we have been we've been trying to save as many hedgerows as we can as new development takes place, but often hedgerow management either has already been lacking, or actually after it's been handed over, it's not maintained. And what happens then, that you end up from a very dense hedgerow into these lines of trees, and unfortunately, like most of these trees tend to be ash, and we have ash dieback at the moment. And if the experience on the continent is anything to go by, it is a 98% kill rate. So that means a lot of these hedges that we have at the moment are going to disappear. So we kind of want to start preempting that and kind of show as for how we want to deal with that, because this, I suppose, is what we want those hedges to look like. So what we want to do, there is already an existing national hedgerow appraisal system, but we want to adjust that by actually incorporating it's a UK model from HedgeLink that kind of has 10 categories in terms of management as well. So it basically means that developers can identify the importance of a hedgerow, and then the most important ones, we want to make sure they keep them, but they also identify the management requirements, and we can ask the developer to undertake those then as well before they get handed over. Similarly, what we want to do are hedgerow surveys in our towns and villages, and the whole idea again is to identify sort of the most important ones and determine what sort of state they're in, and then identify the most appropriate management requirements then for those as well, and actually start actively managing this. Like hedgerows are a man-made habitat that will always require I suppose intervention by humans to make sure they kind of stay in this way when they're at the highest biodiversity value. Now, in terms of open space management, so Action 39 relates to the pesticide use policy. There was a big push to kind of reduce the overall herbicide and ideally eliminate it altogether. Whether we'll be able to achieve that, we just don't know quite yet. At the moment, we're testing all sort of alternatives. In this case, our hot foam treatment was we're testing that in various locations. Ultimately, aimed at we have a herbicide policy by the end of this year that kind of clearly outlines where we can or where we intend to use it and where we can't. Similarly, like in terms of the All Ireland pollinator plan, again, where we're kind of looking to see where we can incorporate, I suppose, expand meadow areas, again, supposed to benefit insects. But we will have to make some change. Like one of the big problems at the moment is that the grass, the farmers will not take it, and it's actually a waste product. So what we're actually trying to do is to kind of come up with a way that we can actually kind of use it straight away. And I suppose even yesterday with the Tidy Towns group, they were saying, well, listen, we can help with that. Even does the litter picking out of it, and then it gets collected. But the big question is always, well, what do you do with the grass once it's collected? On the bigger regional parks, farmers will actually take it and they'll use it for their own livestock. But for a lot of roverts and everything, we have nowhere to go with the grass at the moment, and it costs around €1,200 an acre to dispose of it. So we have to come up with a more efficient way of doing that. We'll also need different types of machines. This is one example that you'll see driving around in the likes of Germany, Holland, and Belgium. We don't have these machines in Ireland, so we have to also kind of start looking to see what sort of new machines we are going to need. And also one of the things we want to test, again, this is coming off in the UK and Belgium, Holland, and Germany, where actually for those meadow areas where they actually get livestock in to graze them for a day or two, and it might be somewhat surreal scene, but this is the sort of things that we basically want to try as well to kind of address that big problem. Like a lot of people are looking for meadows, but at the moment we don't quite have the capability yet to kind of deliver on that. More so because we don't have an avenue to get rid of the grass. Another action then as well, so these are sort of in terms of invasive species control, whether it's giant hogweed, Japanese knotweed, rhododendron, Himalayan balsam. All of these already have control programs that are on the way. I mean, the giant hogweed started in 2010. It's mainly prominent around Portmarnock and Swords and around Finglas. Japanese knotweed, again, that control program started in 2018, and we intend to kind of continue that until we have most of the places covered. I think there's around 200 sites now around the county identified. So we try to get rid of those over the next 4 to 6 years. Rhododendron, mainly a problem on Halt. Again, we have been at that since 2010. And Himalayan balsam, again, is mainly a problem in Russian skerries. And again, like we're almost under control, have that almost under control now as well. So we're making at least good progress in terms of invasive species management. In terms of climate change projects, we're looking then at the restoration of the Bog of the Ring and the Mad River. This is also tied in with the R. Balbriggan project, because a lot of local people wanted to see the Mad River restored. So we kind of, I suppose, best practice would say that you kind of look at the whole catchment, not just a bit in the town itself. And I suppose it more or less starts at the Bog of the Ring. So we're kind of looking at the restoration of that whole wetland system. The whole idea, I suppose, the beauty of this is that if you kind of look at all the farmland that we have, we don't really want to sacrifice that in terms of climate change, actually, say, for tree planting. The whole idea, we kind of want to focus more, like we want to make sure in terms of food security perspective, we want to keep a lot of that good farmland, but we're kind of looking in terms of wetland creation or even woodland creation more on the wetter spots. So whether it's the wetlands that are already there or floodplain areas along our estuaries, that's very marginal farmland anyway. And the whole idea is to kind of focus our climate change action and wetland restorations in those areas, because it just means that, like, I suppose we can still kind of deliver on carbon sequestration, for example, and wetland development, while also, I suppose, still allowing for farming to take place at the same time, and we don't have to sacrifice good farmland. Another wetland project as well is the restoration of the wetland at St. Edith's in Donabate. Again, it is well on the way. We're almost finished with that now. There's only a small project now to do then this summer, and already at least we're making good progress with that. And this is likely to be expanded to a larger nature conservation area in the near future. We're also kind of looking at research and monitoring, and again, I thought I'd just, I suppose, show you like two of the actions that we're doing. So one of the things that's planned is the carrying out of an urban bird and bat survey. So again, the whole idea is to work with all the 22 tidy towns groups that we have and local resident associations, Birdwatch Ireland and Bat Conservation Ireland, to kind of, for people to kind of send in their observations of, I suppose, of species they have in their garden or in their estate. And the whole idea is just to find out, I suppose, what state are these urban birds at, and what sort of actions are required. So can we do targeted schemes for nest boxes for swifts, or targeted schemes for nest boxes for house sparrows or starlings, and similarly with bats as well. So we want to see increase our understanding first, I suppose, where they occur at the moment, what the key issues are, and then we can actually take action. Now, that gives everybody an opportunity to get involved. It basically allows everybody to kind of put up a bat box or a bird box, for example. Another thing that we're doing, again, this is done together with the University of Exeter, where they have fitted GPS trackers on our geese. So when they arrive here in September, they basically get fitted with these tags to find out, well, where do they actually go? If we want to protect these their feeding and roosting sites, we need to know exactly where they are. So by putting GPS trackers on them, we know exactly. And these are just some of the initial results where you can see, they're very much focused around the estuaries, but they also doing the low tides, and then also doing high tide. They will actually kind of leave the estuary, but they tend to stay around the estuaries, or even kind of look for the pitches, say in Malahide, for example. So it will give us a good idea if we want to protect their feeding sites. We now know exactly where they are. So I suppose this is just to give you a flavor. Like on the consultation portal, the full plan can be shown with all the actions that are in it. But I thought I'd just give you a flavor, I suppose, of the things that are being planned. In terms of next steps, then, so we have the consultation that started on the 24th of May, and it will continue until the 5th of July. The idea then is, in this full council meeting in September, we want to present all the submissions by the public, and we also want to present the final plan then for approval by the full council, and with the view then to publicize the biodiversity plan in November this year. Now, in terms of how to make a submission, there's, I suppose, two ways of doing that, or three ways of doing it. You can do it online on the consultation page. You can also send it by email to biodiversity@fingal.ie, or you can do it in writing, and the address is given there, and that address is also indicated on the consultation page. So that will kind of give you an idea, I suppose, what is in it and how to make a submission on that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Hans. That was a fascinating presentation and very enlightening, and certainly a great deal of work done. And obviously, when the Biodiversity Action Plan is approved, an awful lot of work to do as well. Questions are coming in. As I say, if you want to submit a question, you can use the Q&A function, which you'll find in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Just type in your question, and we'll present it to Hans. So, first question in already, Hans, and this viewer wants to know, what is the role of climate change in biodiversity loss?
Well, I suppose, like, if you just take an example of our coastal county, like say with sea level rise, increasing storms, a lot of our coastal system, for example, are going to be hammered. There's no other way. There's no other way, I suppose, around that. We can see, I suppose, in Portrane where you have erosion and the dunes are slowly disappearing there. We know with Saltmarsh, we can see that in Rochestown as well. That's slowly eroding away as well. And then I suppose the rising sea levels also will make it more difficult for birds to feed. So like the climate change is going to have a massive impact on biodiversity. If you look at Halt, like in terms of the increased summer temperatures, the dry periods, the high risk of wildfires, that's not only, I suppose, it's not only a risk to wildlife, that's also a major risk to people that live on Halt. So like climate change is going to have a massive impact on biodiversity. And I suppose what the action plan is trying to do, I suppose, two different things. It is first of all trying to kind of capture as much carbon as possible. So in that way, I suppose, to kind of sequester much of the carbon to kind of reduce the overall problem with that, but also the climate change adaptation. So say around the estuaries where we actually looking at to acquire some of the lands and redesign those to allow sort of for flooding to take place. To kind of remove the flood embankments, similarly along rivers, to remove some of those flood embankments and kind of restore the original floodplains. And in that way, we can kind of avoid sort of the worst of the climate change impacts. Because also, if you have very resilient ecosystems, so fully functioning ecosystems, they can adjust a lot easier to these like extreme events compared to sort of systems that are already in quite a bad state.
Right, thanks, Hans. And another question, could we do stuff in our school grounds for biodiversity?
Yeah, no, certainly. Like again, I suppose it depends how big the school ground is. I mean, nest box schemes are certainly a very easy one. You know, whether it's like for any of the birds that I just mentioned there, bats would be a similar one. So like the facade of the school can be fitted with that. You can look at sort of increasing the amount of like shrub planting, flower planting, meadows. Again, it's all dependent on how much space people ultimately have. But yeah, there's plenty of stuff that what people can do in school grounds anyway.
Okay. And I suppose it just depends on the imagination of the school and the school teachers as to what they can actually do.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah. How can we eliminate herbicide use?
With great difficulty. I suppose like we're kind of looking at these. So how can we reduce it further? Like we know, like we kind of went from around 2,500 liters a year. We're I think at 600 now, and like we're now and 400 of those or so, 300 or 400 of those are basically used in graveyards. And again, what we're trying to do there is to see, well, how can you phase out? So there's new designs for graveyards now that actually have eliminated that basically eliminate the need for herbicides. So the Griffin Cemetery, for example, where the graves now are on plinths and there's grass in front of it, and that actually has solved that problem. But with the historical graveyards, what you find is that, because we actually have looked at a lot of those now, the sort of the areas with the gravel beds on the graveyard, like on the individual graves, they're great seeding beds for weeds. And I suppose a lot of people want graveyards to look neat and tidy. Even I suppose like a lot of people will maintain their own grave, but then the neighbors may not have to get the same level of attention, and it leads to a lot of complaints. So we even look at more extreme options where we have to redesign some of the older graveyards where we actually like keep the headstones, but take the grave slabs off and actually kind of like basically kind of put soil back in and kind of re-sow that. They're extreme measures, and I think a lot of people are not quite ready for yet, but that's the sort of discussion that will need to be had. Again, we're looking at the alternatives. So like again, like Dublin 15 at the moment is testing this for us, where they're like last year they stopped using herbicides already in the graveyards, but now they're basically kind of counting the amount of man hours that they need instead to do this all by hand. So we can kind of compare then how much does it cost to use herbicide and how much does it cost to actually do this all, I suppose, with manual labor. And I suppose at the end of the year, we will have then a much clearer idea where we can make changes in certain herbicide use. Areas where we're going to struggle will be invasive species control, for example. We know so rhododendron, chair laurel, there is no real alternatives to those other than using herbicides. But again, when you do that, you only apply to the stump. It's not that you kind of go around with a big knapsack spray and spray everything. So again, you try to kind of keep it to just to an absolute minimum, basically. So yeah, like it's going to be a challenge, but by the end of the year, we at least hope to have a policy that we can kind of start building on, basically.
Now, as you well know, Fingol is a big agricultural county. Over 50% of the county is owned agricultural, and What can farmers do in Fingal to improve biodiversity?
Well, again, there's a lot of opportunities. Like I suppose we know from the Great Partridge Project, like things that they can do. For example, we incorporate like field margins. So usually, like the field margin is the least productive part of the farm. And like by sowing sort of grass and flower mixes in there, it actually provides like a home for a lot of creatures, but also a feeding zone for a lot of creatures. And so by sacrificing a small bit of the farm there, and something like there is sort of agriculture support funding for that sort of stuff, that actually works really well. Hedgerow management, I suppose, like to do that on a much more phased basis. I suppose like keeping the hedgerows kind of like not like square, and just actually just kind of leave them, allow for some more natural sort of shape to the hedgerow. There are also the little tweaks of farming base that can be done. You're kind of looking at excluding livestock from rivers, kind of having buffer zones along rivers to kind of improve, like to kind of reduce the overall loss of soil and nutrients into the river. Again, it's often tweaking that needs to be done in order to kind of get a good result for wildlife as well, to and where you kind of allow for farming to take place too.
Okay. One question here from Noel Mahan. Thank you, Hans. Great work being done. Malahide estuary, both inner and outer, and the urban environs are in need of attention right away. This being the case, can you include Malahide in your calendar for a public presentation?
Yeah, I think Noel was indeed in contact with me already about this. All right, there's no problem organizing a meeting, but like say similar what we've done for scaries. But like in this case, it was actually Birdwatch Ireland that organized this meeting, so they asked me to come and talk to their members. So if there's groups in Malahide that you know of that I can talk to, I gladly do it. There's absolutely no problem. As like I still have sort of like some dates available, sort of like in the last 2 weeks in June. So prior to the close of the consultation date. So if there's anything there that you think this group really would like to kind of hear what you have to say, then we can organize that.
Okay. One here from Chris, who I suspect is from Dublin 15, because he asks, how can we get Fingal County Council to view the Royal Canal as an area of biodiversity? The key rivers have a development buffer of 30 metres to protect the wildlife, but the canal is exempt from this. Same wildlife, otters, bats, kingfishers, but no protection, just development planned along the banks. He's noticed that the Royal Canal didn't get an action in the 100 actions, primarily because it is being viewed as an amenity rather than a wildlife zone.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the buffer zone, that should be 30 meters as well. That's just the first time I actually never copped that, like there's no 30-meter buffer there. So I will have to look into that. But in terms of the actions, it is actually in there. And I'm going to have a quick peek here in the plan now, because I know this was asked before, but no, because I do know it is actually in there. Hold on for one moment, because I don't know the number off the top of my head now. But a quick look here. Yeah. So like I suppose there is action number 19. It's basically to seek to establish an ecological corridor to link the Royal Canal, the Talca River, and the Liffey Valley. And the whole idea, I suppose, with that is to actually that green set that I was talking about earlier on. The whole idea that, like, yes, like I said, because there's a greenway proposal in there, but that greenway will have to be done in such a way that that ecological corridor function basically remains intact as well. We can't have one or the other, because it is still like a class as what is a proposed natural heritage area, but it's one of the few real natural places left in Dublin 15, and it's will be important that whatever greenway proposal put in there, that they take that into account. And similarly, where we actually want to kind of like, there's a couple of linkages with the Liffey Valley that we want to improve. There are also 2 actions in the plan as well, to kind of get links via Westmanstown and via Kellystown into the Lotterstown Golf Club at the main, and then from there through that to the Liffey Valley as well.
You mentioned Lutterstown Golf Club there. There's about over 25 golf courses in Fingal. Are they good or bad for biodiversity?
Well, they're surprisingly good, actually. I was expecting a slightly different answer to that when we did the survey work, but the golf courses along our coastline, for example, support the highest concentration of legally protected species. And again, that's actually largely down to, I suppose, enlightened greenkeepers. They know what is important, and I suppose they actually have been protecting a lot of those species that are there. So, yeah, no, they're certainly very important for that. Again, we have started now with the first biodiversity plans now that we kind of want to work with the golf courses to kind of see where we can enhance that as well. So again, and the golf courses are quite receptive to that too. So I have to say, like, I definitely think there will be a lot of work done over the next couple of years.
Okay. Another question for you. Will the 30 priority actions have a biodiversity neutral impact on Fingol overall, or will it be net positive?
Well, I suppose if you look in the overall context, like in terms of like halting biodiversity loss by 2030, we're not going to achieve that. That's, like, I suppose if we don't implement all these actions, a lot of stuff will be missed, and we know that. But I suppose with the 30 that are there, it will certainly have a beneficial impact on those particular areas. So like the likes of Rochestown Estuary, the likes of Halt, we like to think that a lot of the biodiversity loss that has been witnessed there over the last decades, that at least that can be reversed.
Okay, and you mentioned in the action plan green car parking. What's that meant? What's meant by that? And will it apply to all new car parks?
Well, again, the green car parking, I suppose we have a few of them, and it basically the idea is that instead of having tarmac or concrete, where you actually have grass growing in the car parking place, basically. So not so much on the road surface, but usually on the parking base. And again, we have those like in Turvey Nature Park, for example. And the whole idea with that is that the water can actually infiltrate in there. And therefore you don't have as much hard surfaces, and it will allow water then to store in there as well. So it reduces the overall amount of urban runoff. And again, like I think we're going to see a lot more of those in the years to come as well, because again, we have to make changes the way we develop. I suppose we're kind of looking at more green roofs, green walls, green car parking. You're kind of looking at, I suppose, more like open space that caters for wetland development and pollinator friendly planting and the likes of that. So there's a lot that there certainly will be changes required. All right.
And just in regard to that green car parking and you know, people now parking on grass, what happens in the winter when there's a lot of rain and it gets muddy and
no, you see, like the beauty of these car parks, for like the actual frame, as we call it, like it's like a honeycomb structure. That's actually all concrete, and the idea is that in between that sits the grass, and it sits slightly lower, so they don't get as muddy in the first place because the grass and the mud are slightly lower, and the cars will still be able to drive over the concrete. So they are actually not, even in winter time, they will function as well as the way they should be.
Okay, thanks. Question from Jenny, and Jenny wants to know, a big part of the success of this will be to educate people on the importance of letting grass and wildflowers grow. How will you do this?
Okay, well, we actually discussed this yesterday with the Tidy Town groups as well. My colleague Deborah, she is working with 22 Tidy Town groups, and they have identified areas where they want to allow the grass to grow. And for full as wildflower management as pollinator schemes. The whole idea there, I suppose, is for people to get used to that and explain why we're doing these things. I suppose there's still a lot of people that they understand the importance of wildflowers, but don't necessarily always want to see them in their own housing estate. So the idea is more to kind of showcase these areas and kind of explain to people why we're doing it. And we kind of hope then, I suppose, for people kind of see them more regular, that they actually, I suppose, over time will get used to it. It is a change of attitude that is required, and that change of attitude that will take a bit of time, I suppose, to bring about.
Okay, another question from Noel Mahan. I'm not sure if it's a question or statement, but it's Malahide Castle and woodlands and parklands are very important. And with what the proposals you mentioned, and obviously it's under pressure to survive. So I suppose he's probably wondering how the Biodiversity Action Plan can help Malahide Castle and domains.
Well, the idea there again is kind of looking at, I suppose, where the value is. Like the woodland itself would be an important feature, for example. So like woodland, like I think there's a woodland management plan already. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done to those woods to kind of get them in good ecological condition. That's certainly true. The meadows that are there, again, like you know, because it's an event space as well, so that like there will be wildflower meadows, there will be short grass areas, and interestingly, I suppose those short grass areas are also used a lot by the migratory birds associated with the Malahide estuary. We do know that as well. So like I suppose, so we do, even I suppose if you look at it from that perspective, the soccer pitches that are there, we actually have an international responsibility to make sure we actually keep them there, because those are actually the places where the migratory birds go and feed. They're sort of the key features at the moment, and the whole idea there is to see, I suppose, what what we can do to kind of make sure that they are in good ecological conditions. They are under a lot of pressure. There's no doubt about that. It produces recreational pressure, dogs and everything, and that certainly leads to an overall sort of like poorer state of those woodlands in terms of flora and fauna. There's no doubt about that. I think the difficulty will be to try to manage the I suppose the human pressures in a domain like that. And not only for Malahide, may I add, there's also go for Newbridge and Art Gillens and Catherine's Park, Halt, our estuaries, like, because I suppose as more and more people move into our county, more and more people will start visiting these places, and I suppose it requires a lot of careful thinking as to how we deal with that recreational pressure. And I suppose even like the development of greenways, say along our coastline, I think, oh my God, that's going to have a big impact. But I think the whole idea there is that as long as you locate those greenways away from the ecologically sensitive areas, it gives people a route where they can follow to enjoy, I suppose, that natural environment, while at the same time not having a serious negative consequence on the sensitive ecology of our coastline.
Okay, you mentioned tidy towns in a previous answer, and George Mungy from Swords Tidy Towns has a question for you. The plan is for 8 years, which is over a long time. What type of funding have Fingal County Council committed to its implementation, and how will the plan be monitored?
Well, I suppose at the moment, like the current budget sits around €500,000, and that kind of covers all the different areas that we do in terms of biodiversity, whether it's the biosphere, invasive species control, biodiversity actions, and then there's another fund as well, say to kind of cover land acquisition. So that's, I suppose, the money that is there at the moment. So there's 2 staff allocated. We also have now like a temporary graduate park superintendents that working with us as well. And so in terms of resources, that is what's available at the moment. And then in terms of the monitoring and the implementation of that, the whole idea, like, and that sets it out in the full plan, basically, where we actually will be doing sort of a progress report on an annual basis to kind of show, I suppose, the actions that are implemented and how they're progressing. So the whole idea is meant to be transparent. The reason why it's for 8 years, I suppose, is that we wanted to work back from 2030, where you can kind of see, okay, like, well, if that is the target for the EU, because it also looks like there's a nature restoration law coming down the tracks as well from the EU, and that Ireland basically will have to restore its habitats that are in a bad state at the moment. I think there's 91% of all habitats in Ireland are in a bad state, and they have to restore that then by 2030, and it's going to hit Ireland like a freight train. Because we're not prepared for that whatsoever. But these are the sort of things, I suppose. So that's why we kind of took 2030. We were back from there, and now it's supposed for us to find those resources to kind of make sure that we know we can do those 30, or like if we can get those extra resources, it will actually allow us to do all 100 of them.
Okay, that probably leads into the next question, which is, if we're serious about this as an emergency, how can the document credibly say that we only have the resources to do 1/3 of the required actions? So that's your 30 actions against the 100 that you've outlined.
Yeah, well, I suppose we did a resourcing plan around it. So like the 100 actions, I suppose they have been put forward by loads of different people. And they're all, let's say, some of those were experts in their fields. Others were kind of, I suppose, like looking at like, well, you know, if we want to do because no different even said, if you look at a climate action plan, we took those actions. They all come with their own funding requirements. And actually, when you actually price this all out, we actually discovered that we need a lot more resources in terms of money and in terms of staff if we all want to make that happen. And I suppose that is the reality of it, and that's one reason why we did it, because I suppose the previous plan, the commentary on that was like, well, you haven't implemented it. But this time around, I suppose we kind of looked at more like the resources issue and to see how we can deal with that. And it will be now up to, I suppose, to the councillors and the likes to kind of look at budgeting, and also for the council members to look at staffing, and ultimately then to decide, I suppose, what we're going to implement and what we're not going to implement.
Okay, you mentioned hedgerows and in your presentation, and one question here is, are the council staff who cut grass and hedgerows aware of the biodiversity plans for those grasses and hedgerow areas when they set out to work?
Yeah, and I suppose it's just to say as well, like, I suppose we have found with operations, I suppose our operations department was responsible for a lot of the outdoor maintenance, you're actually pushing an open door. like a lot of them are very willing to kind of consider, okay, like for long grass areas and for hedgerow management. In terms of hedgerow management, it's the training, the knowledge for proper hedgerow management that is often missing. So that's what I mentioned earlier, that we will actually organize training for them to show them how to do that. It's also actually working with the local tidy town groups, where we will be organizing like hedge laying events with local communities to make people aware of the fact that we're not butchering the hedgerow. This is actually required action. So we're kind of working with the Hedgerow Society and the National Hedge Laying Association to kind of do a lot of those events, because again, it's an outreach not only for the local community, because again, I think there will be a lot of misunderstandings around that as well, because I suppose we know as soon as you touch a tree, people will let me know. The whole idea, I suppose, is more that we kind of want to explain it to people, why are we doing this? And then similarly, I suppose, with the grass cutting, because this is, I suppose, something that came up yesterday as well, because a lot of the tidy towns want to see more long grass areas. But as I was already saying earlier in my presentation, is that once we crack that nut as to what to do with the grass, we can actually roll this out on a much bigger basis. At the moment, we haven't quite done that yet, but I suppose that's really what we're working on now on an urgent basis, because the sooner we can do that, the more we can kind of roll out. And as I say, operations people are happy enough with that. I suppose often what you see is that, I suppose, the way we react to complaints, oh, well, we'll just cut the grass. People will rarely tell us like, oh, this is great to see all these wildflowers here. What normally actually happens, we get all these complaints like, why is this grass still not cut? And I suppose this will be, I suppose it's important where the public also would actually indicate this is great. And then once it gets cut because someone complained about it, then we'll get onto the council to complain that the grass was cut in the first place. So I suppose it's a bit of a catch-22 for us. We never do the right thing. And this is, I suppose, where that communication piece, and that's why comes in, and that's why I suppose we kind of start now with the tidy towns, that all of them have sort of areas selected for this purpose, and that will kind of get people sort of the idea, I suppose, what we're trying to get across here, what it's going to look like, and then ultimately where I suppose people learn to accept some of that. It may not be suitable everywhere, but the really small open spaces, maybe in the residential areas, that may not suit because they're little kickabouts or something. But the whole idea is to kind of work with those local communities to find out, well, where do those opportunities lie, basically.
Okay, Mahan is still looking for that event in Malahide. Your presentation, that he's wondering if anybody from Fingal County Council can help organise it. But I suppose the biodiversity team will take that away and have a look at it and see if something's possible. He wants to make a point just in regard to Malahide Castle has green car parking, and it is a big mess when met, and he can supply photos if required. And he also mentions that Malahide Beach is in need of your support now as the banks have fallen into the sea. Were you aware of that?
Well, I know there's coastal erosion taking place in Malahide. I certainly know that, all right. But there's coastal erosion taking place in Portmarnock. There's in Claremont Beach, Portrand, on a bait. I mean, we have cliff erosion in Halt. We have cliff erosion in Balbriggan. Again, this is an issue that is happening absolutely everywhere at the moment. And again, I suppose the climate change scenario, and I suppose there's nothing extreme about it yet, but I suppose what we did notice, because I suppose we've been involved in Portrand in particular, where like the wave buoy out on Lambay Island, like during the Beast of the East, for the first time ever, recorded a wave that's 6 meter high. If there's more of that sort of stuff coming, then our coastline is going to have a lot more of these problems. The question, I suppose, is then how do we react to that? Like, do we allow, I suppose, are we going to basically put rock armor everywhere? Because I suppose that's often a first solution, the hard engineering solutions. But the only thing that will do is often actually move on the problem. Because then the wave energy, when they hit, say, rock walls, will actually either go sideways, and it will basically go where the rock revetment stops, and then where the dunes are exposed, it will actually start eroding that more severely. But what it can do is actually kind of turn the wave inward, and it will actually pull the whole beach away. So there's no straightforward solutions to this. And again, often when you allow nature to do its own thing and give, I suppose, our coast the space to allow for erosion to take place. So even if you look at Malahide Beach, there's actually quite a significant area of dunes still left there. And the whole idea, I suppose, is ideally to allow for that, because some of that is actually cyclical. sometimes what you actually see, like say, like where we have seen this in even on Malahide Beach as well, there's actually old structures that are sitting, that are becoming apparent now, that used to be there and that are visible again. We know in Portrane on the beach there, where like actually, like, because we have been looking at the maps for the coastal defense project there since the 1830s, and where you can actually see like this, the sand is being moved from north to south over around a 25 to 30-year cycle. So again, I suppose by not interfering in that, and I know it's a natural reaction, but it's actually better to kind of do the, even if you look at Claremont Beach as well, there is actually a seawall that sits at the back of the houses. It was completely covered over. I have pictures of the past where it shows that it's gone. I've also pictures that actually show a huge dune in front of it, and now it's eroding again. So it's a continuous changing process, and again, it's often you're better off not to kind of mess too much with that, because by, I suppose, tweaking parts of the system, you have absolutely no idea what you're actually changing and where the change is going to occur.
And I think I saw a project recently in Portmarnock, was it, where they were replenishing the dunes, like by resowing the grass in order to help it.
Yeah, so like, I suppose in Portmarnock there's two problems there. I suppose there's again a very high visitor pressure. So like a lot of people are trampling on the dune. The dunes that were eroding, actually kids were using that for running up and down, which is great fun for kids, and I do get that. But unfortunately, like if so many kids are doing that, it basically slowly actually just kind of takes the whole dune apart. So like I know my colleagues in operations have already been putting fencing along it. There's actually more fencing going in, and we'll be doing some work on the pathways as well to kind of, and putting up signage so to guide people away from those areas, kind of asking people not to enter those, and kind of therefore give the dune a chance to recover. Again, the grasses that were planted is marron grass, and the whole idea that they were harvested from elsewhere within the dune, but the whole idea by planting those, that will actually help to fix the dune. Like say, like once those root systems start growing, it actually helps to kind of keep the dune intact. But again, visitor pressure there is the big one, because like if you plant loads of that stuff and people keep on walking over it, it won't be effective.
Okay, we were talking about the grass cutting earlier, and there's another question that's come in here. And remember, if you do want to put a question in, if you can go into the Q&A facility, and there's a couple coming in on the chat as well. So coming in on two fronts. But in my area, the green areas were being left unmowed to support insect life, etc. Now the mowing has resumed because a small number of local people said that they wanted a lawn. This is a lack of conviction, not a lack of resources. What can be done to change the culture in the council to take this seriously as an emergency?
Well, I suppose one of the suggestions, actually, because this was a big complaint as well by the tidy towns groups, what they were actually suggesting would be actually develop some sort of grass cutting policy that clearly outlines where we're going to be cutting what. And I think so they were actually proposing that as an action that is not in the biodiversity plan at the moment, but to actually kind of to use that then to kind of identify where the different mowing regimes should take place, and also then how to communicate that to people. Because I suppose often when people don't know that this is being done, that's when people start complaining about it. So it does require a lot more consultation, I suppose, with residents to kind of talk to them and kind of explain to them what these, I suppose, we kind of looking at creating wildflowers here and there. I suppose one of the actions, and unfortunately it did make this priority action as well, was basically where we actually have 3 demonstration sites in the county, so 3 housing estates that would kind of get a biodiversity makeover. And the whole idea there was that we would run it as a competition. So residents put themselves forward, not the council won't select this, it's a resident association that could put themselves forward for this, where the housing estate gets kind of like a makeover. And like say in different grades, so you can do 3 designs for the estate that kind of covers the open space and the front gardens of people, where you're kind of looking at the Rolls Royce, like, you know, like literally go all out, to like say a Fiat Punto version and something in between. And basically what it does, people can kind of see that, okay, like if we want to really do stuff for biodiversity, this is what we can do. And if we want to do less of that, then I suppose that's okay as well. It is more people can see, even if they start with the sort of the reduced version, they know, well, actually, if we do a little bit more, if once they kind of get used to, I suppose, the things, whether it is some meadow planting or say more shrubbery planting, or even kind of diverting some of the surface water drains into small wetland areas or ponds. These are all sort of things we can kind of look at to see how does that work, how I suppose, how do people experience that, and it also then is an example for other housing estates that they can see what can be done for biodiversity and what it's going to look like.
Okay, comment from Chris. You're right about educating the public. The conversation in our estate WhatsApp group last night was whether spraying or burning the weeds on the curbs was best, and Chris says that was very disheartening. And Jenny suggests here, Could local composting centres be set up for grass cuttings or link in with, say, horse riding centres?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. That's what need. So like the composting we already explored. Given that we have so many acres of grassland, the local composting facilities don't want to see us coming. They're simply because it will actually, it basically kind of, it causes a lot of problems for the composting process. They need a mixture of things. Like grass is quite high in nitrogen and poor in carbon. So like you basically mess up the composting process if you have too much of one than the other. So, and given that we literally have hundreds and hundreds of acres, if we start bringing that to them, because we explored that already as well. So we know that that's not really the way to do it. In terms of the horse riding centers, yeah, so like we have done that actually on Halt, where we have meadows there that are being cut, and we actually have a small baler. A contractor does this for us, but he makes it into small bales, and the horse owners actually will take all of that. So that's indeed a very sustainable way of doing it. Similarly, in the big regional parks, where farmers actually they cut the hay for free and take it away. So it's kind of a benefit to us and to them. In terms of I suppose the housing estate itself, then, because farmers tend to be less interested in that. But again, like, because I know that one of my colleagues, he was, I suppose, already talking to the DAA to see whether a biogas installation in the center of our county might be a solution to this problem. Because the DAA also produce a lot of grass cutting clippings for the grass cutting that they do at the airport. So they're kind of like, is it something based that could be combined? And so you basically have a biogas installation, and so you have both energy, and then I suppose the residual material then is actually a really good fertilizer and could be used by farmers in the locality then as well. So that's certainly something that I think in the long term is probably what may solve that problem, but we're not there quite yet.
Okay, very interesting. Just another comment from Chris, followed by a question. I get very frustrated when I see local politicians sharing updates on social media about ivy being removed from walls, trees being cut or trimmed in the nesting season. Are Fingal County Council operations on board with their actions being biodiversity friendly? In other words, scheduled around the nesting season?
Well, most of them are aware of that. I suppose like it can be better. Let's put it that way. There's certainly scope for improvement there, and part of that is training. I think it's even just to kind of make people really fully aware, like, you know, when you do certain actions, what the consequences of that might be. And like, I suppose sometimes I do it for general reason, because I know even hedge cutting in the nesting season is a big no-no as well. But I suppose, like, in terms of, say, like some of the sideline issues, I do know from my roads colleagues, because they would have shown me some of the areas that they are kind of wondering, well, is it okay to cut this or not? Because we can't see around the bend here. And I suppose at that point, you're kind of like, well, clearly there is a safety issue here. So in that case, it is like you actually are allowed to kind of intervene, but there's a process you will have to kind of go to kind of explain why you're doing these things.
Okay. Another question, just can you remind us how people can participate in the next stage of the process? And we're obviously at public consultation at the moment.
Well, I suppose the main thing at the moment is that I suppose we're looking for people to kind of submit, to make submissions. If there's particular actions that you support, I suppose let us know. Like at the moment, we have identified 30 priority actions. I suppose from the previous consultation events I've organized now, there's certainly the others that people feel that others also should be prioritized. So I suppose I would ask people to kind of look at that critically at the list of actions that they kind of say, listen, we think the following is important and why. And I suppose also, like in terms of the overall approach that we're taking, are you okay with that? Are there actions that are not in it? And that really should be included in this that we have missed out on as well, which is just as important. And again, because I don't confess to we like to know all about about every locality. So there might be, because already I've seen like some submissions that came in from Malahide, for example, about areas that are rich in swifts. Again, it's like, okay, yeah, we'll do something with that. So that's really the key thing. So make the submission, and so like there's different ways of doing that, whether it's on the consultation portal or to biodiversity at fingal.ie. I suppose, and it's to write in prior to the 5th of July. Because like I said, like all these submissions, it will be really good to kind of just to see, I suppose, what people are really interested in, and I suppose things that we have missed, because we could do want to make sure that given that we have until 2030 to kind of achieve this target, that we're trying to get in as many as we can.
Yeah, and I suppose just, you know, like when people talk about public consultation, that they tend to think of objections or you know, the things you've missed, as you've just said. But if you've got something right, you probably want to hear about that as well, do you?
It's just as important. Yeah, you see, like on itself, like whether there's a reprioritization of some of those actions that can well happen. And the whole idea is more that we need to know, I suppose, where people's priorities lie. Like these were identified mainly by us because those are existing projects are already underway. So the question is more like, well, I suppose, do we wind down some of them in favor of others? And these are the considerations that will have to be made, you know. So that's why we kind of also ask people like, what which of the actions do you support, and also actions that you think are missing, they should be in there as well. So it's both really.
Yeah, I think this next question turns on touches on what we were talking about in terms of greens and that, but just one viewer wondering if it's possible to designate, say, 30% of all greens as habitats, and in other words, uncut areas for wildlife.
Yeah, like I suppose the 30%, it's something I suppose that's I think in the EU is the kind of 30% of land and 30% of the sea, I think, is to be set aside for biodiversity. Theoretically, it's certainly possible, and I suppose it's certainly something that that you can look where we know how much open space we have, and that we actually ultimately aim for that 30% to be set aside for wildlife. And that's not necessarily uncut areas, may I add. That could be meadows as well. That because meadows still need to be cut once a year. It is not a matter of just like not cutting it anymore. So there's still active management required, and that could tie in, for example, with say a grassland management policy. That ultimately that's really what we're aiming for. The 30% of our open space is set aside for biodiversity. It's a good idea. It's certainly a possibility anyway. So like that's if people have ideas like that, that's the sort of stuff that would be great to go into a submission.
Okay, Noel Mahan is back. Just in regard to Fingol had fencing along the beach at Hicks Tower for years, and this was working fine, but it has been neglected, and he feels if it was he wants to know if the fencing was reinstalled, would it help?
Yeah, no, and that is actually on the program for this year. It's actually like we have seen the fencing. I presume this is at the car park there, at Malahide Beach. Yeah, that is to be fixed, because that is ideally to be fixed in the next month or so, before the main season starts. So.
Okay, that's it. That makes them happy.
Yeah.
Could we have a triage system to apply to each community area, like marks out of 10 for wildlife friendliness? This might help to show people that an overgrown laneway may be the best area for wildlife in that area.
Again, it's a great idea, all right, but the question is more who's going to do that. Because you see, like we have, like I know my colleague Debbie, she is doing a lot of that public outreach, but she's dealing with 22 tidy town groups alone, so 22 cities, towns, and villages she's already dealing with, and then it's also then individual community groups and residential estates. At the moment, we simply don't have the capacity to actually do that. But yeah, again, like in principle, it is a very good idea.
Another question in regard to operations. Again, Chris wondering if the nesting season is on operations radar when they're scheduling summer works.
Well, again, as I said before, like they know about it, but as I said elsewhere, like there's always room for improvement there to kind of look at the type of works that you want to do, and kind of do it at the right time of the year.
Okay. What is the most effective way to get more of the possible actions taken on board? Is it to send a submission on the proposal draft plan, or to contact local representatives, or both, or something else? So I think that's increasing the 30.
Yeah, I think on itself that is indeed like it's both really. So ideally, I suppose we want people to kind of make the submissions, but also I suppose let the councillors know about some of the thoughts that you have. I suppose there was a very robust debate already among councillors. I suppose they have all received like a presentation like this as well, where we have explained, I suppose, what we can do in terms of, and also in the context of the resources that we have. So again, it's more for councillors to know, like, well, if you want, I suppose, to achieve that 2030 target, that this might not be good enough, well, then I suppose you make that known. If there's actions that you think like, should be delivered as priority actions, again, you kind of make the submission, but also let your councillors know. Because in September, when the councillors will approve the plan, ultimately that will then decide on what the priorities are going to be. Because I say, like, we will make recommendations in terms of priorities. Now, the councils also have a say in this as well. So that's why it's important that you kind of liaise with your councillors as well at the same time. So ideally, you do both.
You mentioned the biogas plan, and that which is a climate action solution, and one viewer said they absolutely love that idea, and it's a really progressive one. So that could be something that people would like to see. question here from Jenny. More and more people are cementing their front gardens. Would it be an idea that you have to get planning permission for this?
Yeah, no, I've seen it in my own street here as well. It's happening a lot. Say that we don't make the planning rules as such, so this is coming more from central government. Ideally, indeed, you kind of, again, the permeable paving, the grass paving, or even just like those type of pavers filled with gravel, if you want a slightly more urban look, still actually provide a suitable alternative. So my own driveway is actually made out of these pavers as well, and I know I have two neighbors who exactly have done the same thing after they'd seen it here. It's often that people don't know it, because it's actually quite easy, like on itself, all the drainage kind of flows into there and just kind of goes back into the groundwater again. And that's ultimately, but it's often that people don't actually understand that this is the case. So again, ideally, again, it is one of the actions in the plan to kind of develop guidance around this. But unfortunately, again, it wasn't one of the priority actions that we can deliver on, because again, it's certainly going to require a lot of hand-holding with developers, particularly in the beginning, to kind of get them to switch over from ordinary concrete driveways to something completely different, or like say public car park and all those sort of things, to actually change the designs of that. So that's quite a labor-intensive sort of thing to do. And again, at the moment, we don't have any planning ecologists, or I suppose people that deal with that sort of planning, to kind of get those things implemented. So we're not in position at the moment to do that. And as I appreciate, it is important, but I suppose we just don't have the staff to kind of address it at the moment.
Okay, we're coming close to the end because I've gone through the list of questions that are in front of me. I just have one that I'll add in for myself. It was when you were talking about the Brent geese and the study that you're doing with the University of Exeter, and how you're mapping where the Brent geese go when they come here. Do you also map where they go when they leave here?
Well, actually, funny enough, there was 3 trackers that actually stayed alive. That was unexpected. So these trackers are meant to fall off basically as the birds are molting, usually in Iceland or Canada, and that didn't happen. So by fluke, so when the birds came back, the data loggers that were in the estuaries actually picked up these birds after being away, basically from April till September. And it's for the first time ever that the researchers in Exeter University, they were absolutely thrilled, because they were able to tell where the bird went exactly, because they could follow the GPS trackers. They were able to say how long the bird sit on the nest, because it didn't move. And it was able to show like how because they all went to the Canadian Arctic basically. They were able to show like how long it sat on the nest, how long it was feeding the chick, and like I suppose how long it took them to raise the chick and actually make its way back again. So like it is remarkable, I suppose, with that sort of technology, the sort of stuff that you can find out. And so like we have done it on the Brent geese. At the moment, we started a second project now with Exeter University as well, where we're also tagging oyster catchers, curlew, redshank, again, just to find out where do those species go, because like I said, they're the typical species that actually tend to leave the estuary during high tide. So again, I kind of hope that one or two of those will actually kind of stay on them as well. And again, it will give us a great overview, I suppose, how those birds move, I suppose, beyond Europe and into Canada and in Russia, just to see, I suppose, where they end up and when they come back again. So personally, I thought it was fascinating, but.
Just one final question from Jenny. She wants to know, and I think you covered this earlier in the thing, but why weren't all the 100 actions approved when we're in such a crisis?
Well, I suppose the 100 actions was more a reflection of what we need to do. And I suppose when we kind of looked at the resourcing of it, unfortunately, like it says, like there's competing resources, like in terms of like for housing, we need more architects. In terms of roads, like they need to be provided with all the new development, sports facilities, community centers, all of these things, I suppose, require resources, and it does mean that some very hard decisions need to be made. And I suppose at that point, like I suppose there was no approval for extra resources to do this. So that's why we included all the 100 actions, I suppose, just to reflect we do know what needs to be done. But we, I think that for us it was more that like once we know what needs to be done, it's now working back from that. And I suppose seeing, whether the council can find those resources or whether the central government can provide those resources, because again, this has been raised now with the minister as well. I mean, like only recently at the biodiversity conference, the minister did announce 6 extra biodiversity officers for local authorities, and I suppose, as that was pointed out, well, I suppose Fingol by itself needs 6. So I mean, I think sort of nationwide, or in an Irish context, the whole nature conservation scene is so under-resourced, that we're so far behind. And I suppose it's more reflection of that, but I think it was important just to show all the things that can be done and need to be done. And now I suppose it's kind of finding the resource to kind of make that happen by 2030.
Yeah, well, I suppose you've started the conversation, which is probably a good starting point.
Exactly.
Yeah, look, I think we'll leave it there. We thank you very much indeed to everybody for logging in tonight. Thank you very much indeed for all your questions and comments. It certainly made it a lot easier for me as the person interviewing Hans. If you want to watch tonight's webinar again, a recording will be available later this week on the biodiversity website, which you can find on fingal.ie. And remember, if you do want to make a submission on the Draft Biodiversity Action Plan, you can do so up until July the 5th at 11:59. On Fingal County Council's consultation portal, which is consult.fingal.ie. And as Hans said earlier, we want to hear your thoughts, whether they're positive or negative or whatever, but any observations that you have to make in relation to the plan, can you please make those submissions, because as Hans said, they're very, very important, and they do have an effect on any decisions that are made in drafting up the final action plan. A copy of the action plan can be downloaded from the portal, and it's also available to view at County Hall in Swords and also at the civic offices in Blanchardstown. My thanks to Hans Lisser for joining us this evening. I hope you, like me, found what he had to say very informative. If you're interested in hearing more from Hans on biodiversity, then you should listen to episode 17 of the Inside Fingal podcast, which can be downloaded from the fingal.ie website or wherever you get your podcasts from. We'll have another webinar with Hans tomorrow week, Thursday, June the 23rd at 7 p.m. So tell your friends, neighbours and family to tune in, and even yourself, if you feel in the time that's gone between now and then that there's other questions that you want to pose to Hans, we'd be delighted if you join us for that. But until we meet again, goodbye and stay safe.